Translation is hard work. Very rarely does one word from one language map perfectly onto another word from another language. Generally, what we have are semantic ranges. Think of a Venn diagram, where the meaning of one word in one language overlaps with the meaning of a word in another language. And what we're trying to do is find words where the overlap is as high as possible, or as specific as possible. And so in one circumstance, a word may be translated using one word in English, and in another circumstance, it might be a different word in English that's the best word to convey that meaning or that part of the semantic range. All of that just means it's really hard to make an English translation of something like the Bible. And so I have great respect for all of the scholars who work on any of the major Bible translations. But one of my big pet peeves is where our English translations will choose one word to translate a word, and then choose another word even when they're in the same pericope, where it's very clear that in the Greek or in the Hebrew, these two words are meant to be speaking about the same thing. They're a callback, they're a reference to each other. When we choose different English words with slightly different semantic ranges, we confuse or we obfuscate the connection between those two uses. And one of the words that is really notorious for this in the New Testament is the word Aionios. Sometimes it's translated the age, sometimes it's translated as eternal. And while both of those do fit within the semantic range of Aionios, those are two very different words, two very different ideas in English. And so to translate one use of Aionios within one pericope, one time using the age and one time using eternal, is really going to make it hard for us as English readers to follow the thread. And one of the most pointed examples of this comes in one of Jesus' most famous parables, the sheep and the goats of Matthew 25.
Because the question in chapter 24 that spurs this monologue from Jesus was, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And it just so happens that that word age in the disciples' question is the key word here in Jesus' answer. See, in English, we read this word eternal. But in Greek, that's the word aionios. And aionios is the same word, the adjectival form of the word that the disciples used to ask about the end of the age, or the ion. See, the problem is, we read eternity, and we immediately jump to all kinds of metaphysical assumptions about the eternal and never-ending states of bliss and or torture. But that is clearly, evidently not how the Greek language, or particularly how the Greek people used this word. They thought about the end of an eternity. For example, you may have heard these words in English, right? Eon, epoch, even era. All of those words are related back to this single Greek word ion. And in Greek, an ion was not conceptual eternity. It was a long period of time marked by some important or distinguishing factor that kept it going. So Homer uses ion to describe the life of his most important characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They represent for him an age, just like the disciples used the word. And we say this kind of thing in English too, right? It was the age of King Arthur. That's an ion. In fact, our word epoch, that comes from Greek as well. It meant stoppage, but it referred specifically to the stop, to the end of an ion. And so when we say we've entered a new epoch, what we're saying is that the old eternity has come to an end, a new has begun. Now, at the same time, an ion is so important, so special by definition, that in some ways it never fades away. The age of King David, for example, is still very much with us today. We read about him, we study his life. His age is eternal in that it never fades. Still, though, that doesn't quite mean what we assume it does when we hear the word eternal in English. Here's another way to think about this. Those of us who believe in eternal life, like I do, we also believe in death, right? So life is not constant, unchanging, forever eternal. Life is eternal in the sense that it evolves and it transforms. Life is so alive that even in death it becomes something new. That's also what we mean when we use the word eternal. And this has an incredibly important parallel in Hebrew thought as well. Two terms that the disciples are very specifically referencing in chapter 24. The olam haba and the olam hazah. Now, these are Hebrew terms, but olam hazah meant the age that is. Everything we see around us right now, joy and laughter, sun and love, but also suffering and sin, brokenness and a longing for something more, all of that is olam hazah. And so when the disciples ask, what will be the sign of the end of the age? What they're asking is, when will all of this milieu that we live in, when will all of this finally come to an end? And the corollary, of course, what they really probably want to know is, when will olam haba, or the age to come, begin? Everything that the Jewish people have been longing for, everything the prophets have imagined, when will all of that start, Jesus? And so when Jesus answers using all of these different stories, he riffs on how he will be there to wake us up when the age to come begins. That's the parable of the wedding guests. And how we may have to face the judgment of the age surrounding us right now. That's the parable of the talents. And he talks about how the transition will be marked by the punishment of the age and the life of the age to come, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Point being, when Jesus uses this word aionios, he's not referring to our modern conceptual reality of eternity. He's speaking to a very Jewish imagination of the ages. Ages that the disciples have very specifically asked him about. The eternity that is, the eternity to come. Now, understanding all of this helps us then to make a little bit more sense of what Jesus says next, because Jesus doesn't say the goats go to hell. Sorry, Cake, still a good song. Look it up. What he says is the goats go to eternal punishment. And if you remember, way back at the start of this series, we talked about this word apolia, that word that means destruction or ruin, the place that our worst choices can lead us slowly over time. That's not the word that Jesus uses here. It's not eternal destruction. He uses the word kolasin. And that is a very conspicuous term. Because kolasin is the infliction of punishment or suffering, even pain. But in its earliest form, it actually referred to pruning or to gardening or cutting back a plant to help it grow. And we see this used figuratively in Greek as well. For example, we have an extra biblical text called the Apocalypse of Shadrach. It comes from probably as early as the 2nd century. But it uses this same word kolasin to say, your punishment, O God, is discipline. So it's uncomfortable to be disciplined. And it maybe even hurts a little bit to be pruned, but the point isn't the pain. The image isn't retributive, it's actually restorative. Your punishment is discipline. Your pruning is even for our good. To say that another way, or more clearly, the kolasin aionios is not eternal torture. It is the punishment of the age, perhaps even the discipline that brings this age to a close. Remember the context, the question that started it all. When will this happen? What will be the sign of the end of the age? It will be a lot of pruning. Now, can we say that all of these goats go into that discipline willingly and they participate in the pruning that will heal them and they welcome that correction and gladly enter into the age that is to come? Well, Jesus doesn't tell us any of that. He simply says the goats go on to the discipline of the age and the sheep enter into the life of the age to come. All that you and I can trust is that all of this must be meant for our good somehow.